Hi there, Dave Hawkins again, from the second sip, by the way. And I had done a video the other day that I was, essentially I was struggling with some of the things that I hear on a regular basis with people like the Moonshots mates and All In Podcast and Elon and different people who are all talking about this supersonic tsunami headed our way, the AI world dramatically changing everything in our lives. And also, they frequently talk about things like UBI, Universal Basic Income, or Universal High Income. And the struggle that I have when I hear these things talked about is not so much that, that those things are out there, but that they don't seem to, they don't have a thought out feel to me. It's like, okay, we're going to just throw money at people and everybody's going to be happy. And I can't see that being a benefit long term, because at some point somebody's going to figure a way to capitalize on taking advantage of the money, finding ways to pull the money in. We've already seen it with all of the fraud going on in Minnesota and California and other places, New York. I mean, every place has fraud. And I don't want to, I am bringing up three specific places, but let's face it, fraud and corruption is going to happen everywhere. Anywhere that there's an opportunity, people are going to take advantage of the system. And everybody does. I mean, if you could pay less taxes, you would. Generally, most people would. It's just a natural instinct to try and save what you've earned and not necessarily be put in a situation where you have to work forever if you can avoid it, things like that, or just being able to gain a little bit of advantage so that maybe you are not in a tough spot later in life, or you need to help a family member, or you're a family member that needs help, things like that. So every corruption is a problem that we have no matter what we do when it comes to dealing with programs like a universal basic income or universal high income. And when I hear people talk about throwing out these universal basic incomes or high incomes, first thing that comes to mind is what happens. So, the common thread is some form of gentrification in a community. And by the way, you can see this community behind me. This is actually the World's Fair. I guess it was in the 60s. And they basically, this is the grounds that they planned and then eventually built for the World's Fair in order to demonstrate, the wonderful future that was ahead for all of us. And in some respects, we're experiencing some of that wonderful future. It is wonderful in some ways, but it also has a tendency to not be so wonderful. And certain things cause that to happen on a regular basis. And the idea in my mind that somebody's going to start some kind of universal basic income is that it eventually stops. It's going to stop. It's not going to stay permanent. It's not, unless you build the system around having some kind of mechanism to deal with that, I'm really not sure how you can maintain a universal basic or high income permanently for everybody, because it requires putting money in somebody's pocket and then assuming that they're going to spend well, and then also assume that nobody's going to figure out how to take some of that money going into that pocket along the way, where eventually the person who gets the money only gets a portion of it and doesn't actually get the amount that would have sustained them. And that comes in situations where urban planning, like you see behind me, is something that gets used, and diverting some of those funds and finding ways to use those funds on behalf of the person who the funds were intended for. And some of the problems that I see with the idea of a universal basic income or universal high income, I'm going to just say UBI from now on. The UBI is that political parties, if it's run by the government, political parties are going to break it down. political parties will find a way to steal from it. One party introduces a plan, the other party knocks it down, just because it's an opposition thing. If it's a right wing versus a left wing, the right wing will propose something, the left wing must knock it down because that's the nature of the party. Likewise, it goes in both directions. So most of the projects that I've been researching show this in glaring reality. So there's that first part, which is when a political organization, a city or a government gets involved. Then the second one has to do with when a company gets involved. Now, you may have heard songs from the 50s, 60s, and 70s where they talk about the company store. The company store comes from the company town. Company town comes from the fact that some industry, like the oil industry, the mining industry, whatever, says, hey, let's attract people to this community in the middle of nowhere, out in the middle of nowhere, and let's build a town around our industry because we need people to come work. And because we need people to come work, we've got to bring them here and we've got to attract them. So how do we attract them? We create something like, let's talk about the current most prominent one, the Starbase facility in Boca Chica, Texas, or right out, it's now its own city. So what are they doing? They're going to create neighborhoods. They're going to create shopping. They're going to create services that will sustain the people who live there so that everybody who works at Starbase will have a place to live that's nearby and all the services are made available. And that can be a wonderful opportunity as long as Starbase remains funded, right? As long as the rockets going up into space remain funded. And I would have to say that's probably a nice long project. It's going to be there for a long time. There's a really good long-term potential for that to be sustainable. But in 50 years, 100 years, that may change, and suddenly the community built around Starbase could fail because Starbase maybe is obsolete, no longer needed. So, and this is what happened around oil towns and mining towns and all kinds of different things. As a matter of fact, the nuclear testing that was done for the atom bomb, cities were built in Arizona and in Nevada just to support the people who were developing the nuclear technologies or the atomic bomb and things like that. Some of those places still exist. Some of them are empty. So when you, as a matter of fact, I think, I could be wrong, but I'm pretty certain that the Streets with No Name has something to do, the U2 song, Streets with No Name, comes from when maybe U2 actually saw the cities that were built to be blown up by these scientists that were testing the nuclear bomb. Now, admittedly, that was in the target zone as opposed to the communities that were around it. But nonetheless, some of the communities around it may have dried up the same way simply because without the nuclear testing going on, what was their purpose? And military bases like Nellis out there in the same area, Nellis Air Force Base, there's a whole community built up around Nellis. But if you close the base, if you look at Fort Devens, for example, in Massachusetts, it was built as a military base. They closed that base. Now it's converted, thankfully, but now it's a prison. It's a women's prison or something like that. And they've got other facilities and other things going on there. But if whatever the previous purpose was doesn't get transformed into something new, then it has the danger of drying up, especially if it's in a place where there's no agriculture and the only thing built up around that industry was a town just to serve that industry. And there are many Midwest cities that are towns that are dried up just like that, where they were built solely for the purpose of supporting some industry, and now they're gone. So I did some research, and I'll share some of that with you here today. Basically, what I started to look into was understanding engineered urban planning. Now, I'm putting in the term engineered. And the reason that I want to put in the term engineered is because I'd like to see maybe the ability to do a first principles look at urban planning. And realistically, in a perfect world, urban planning is done where there's nothing. Because when you build everything, you don't have to rip anything down, right? However, if you do that, then you run the risk of some of the problems that actually have happened in the past when those urban plans were put into play. So I have a number of models of urban planning. Some of them right now are probably unpopular. And the reason they're unpopular is because of COVID and because of the lockdowns and because of the FUD put up around the idea that these, like the 15-minute cities, were designed by the World Economic Forum as a way to take over the world and manage everybody and keep people locked into geographic regions and not let them travel. And there was all kinds of FUD around that. And I say it's FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, because the plans didn't come from the World Economic Forum, nor did the plans actually spawn out of COVID or out of the lockdowns. None of the plans came from that. They were simply interpreted through the lens of the people who are deeply affected by COVID and the lockdowns. And, when you have a megaphone called social media and you can get attention, you can use things like, hey, the 15-minute cities are just a way for Klaus Schwab to take over the world, and you're going to own nothing, and you're going to be happy because they're going to make sure they're going to brainwash you into being happy. Maybe, I don't know. I won't say that there isn't a glimmer of truth to some of that, but what I will say is this: the 15-minute and the 20-minute cities have pre-existed this by hundreds of years. These are not strictly recent ideas. So a very good example is the Amish villages in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. This has a history of almost 300 years. They came here with a religious grounding in their lifestyle, and they said, this is how we want to live. And they managed to work with the states and the federal government to maintain build a set of laws that protect the Amish villages from the changes that many of the things that have come afterwards would have imposed on them. And, the community is built around certain precepts like barn raising, right? Mutual people coming together in the community to help somebody build a barn if that's what they needed to do. Coming together to provide loans for each other if they needed to finance something. And that's strictly done inside of the communities. And the way that this all works is that the people who live in the communities know each other. And they've also done some things in those areas, such as making sure that transportation is not an issue. And the reason it's not an issue is because they have horse and buggy transportation, which means you don't need a license. You don't have to own a car. You don't have to pay insurance. And so as a result, the cost of living is super low for anybody who lives who is amongst the Amish community living in the Amish villages. So, and the cooperative element is not communism, but it could be interpreted as a form of communism in some respect. But it's not it's a religious basis, not a government communism like you would see in Russia or somewhere else. But these places like Paris is an example of a planned community. Melbourne, over in Australia, Cleveland, Ohio, Barcelona, Spain, the superblocks. These are all examples of places that are experimenting with and trying ways to put communities together that survive and can not survive, but where the population thrives and where you can protect it. But the problem is that in many cases, it's very difficult to protect those communities. Now, the Amish villages have succeeded in doing this for 300 years, and they have worked hard fighting legal battles over and over again to protect their way of life and their communities. Likewise, you look in places like Florida with the villages and Sun City in Arizona. the 55 and over communities that were planned, where you know that at some point, if you've been working your whole life, your income is going to stop. And when your income stops, you have to reach a point where, how do I survive without that income? And if Social Security can cover the bills, great. But let's face it, that's very difficult. If you tried to just live on Social Security in the middle of New York City, never going to happen. You can't. There's almost no way for people that are retiring on purely a Social Security income could survive anywhere that doesn't have some kind of planned community protections for the people living in that community. And then how they executed these things is really critical, because if you don't have some way to protect those things, you end up with gentrification, which is, you create this wonderful community. If you look at Lennar properties and some of these other really nice properties that exist in Nevada, Arizona, California, Florida. I don't know about California, but Florida, maybe Texas, Tennessee. They have these, and also South Carolina. They have these planned communities, but the price of the houses are like $200 at the low end to $700, even $1 million to move into these communities, and that makes it impossible for somebody of a lower income to make it into one of those communities. And so if you're going to have some kind of a universal basic income and you don't put some kind of infrastructure in place that allows somebody to live on that universal basic income, then they're going to get gentrified right out and they're not going to be able to survive. So a lot of folks have come up with ways for this to happen. They have community land trusts. This is one of the examples. And a community land trust allows you to own the property, and it decommodifies the land itself. So you own maybe the house that sits on the land, and you rent the property from the community. That's how 55 and over communities work for the most part. So the idea is that you're only paying taxes on the land, not the house built on the land, and the house built on the land is considered separate from the land, so that you don't have to pay taxes in the way that you would traditionally. And it helps to make it affordable for the people living in those communities. Now, this Georgeism is a program. There was a gentleman that created this idea. I think I've got his name down here a little further down. Well, actually, I have the definitions here, so let me go grab that. So when you look at Georgeism, it is one of the, here it is. So Georgeism was created by Henry George. And basically the idea is you're only going to be taxed on the unimproved land value, not the buildings or the improvements of the land. And what that does is it keeps the taxes low forever. Now, as long as you don't let a political climate come in that forces them to change that allows you to keep the taxes low, which allows the people living in that community to not necessarily be affluent and rich. So that means that a universal basic income for that type of community could work. And that's really what I'm getting at, is that if you're going to introduce the concept of a universal basic income and you want that to succeed, you have to find ways to build these communities that are going to function. If you give it to a government entity, let me show you what happens. So here's a bunch of failed projects. Now, these failed projects, let me bring up the historical ones here. So back the Housing Act of 1937 and 1949, they decided to put together some urban projects that they were going to use to renew some difficult areas that were struggling. And it had a lot to do with the communities being very poor to begin with. And they were going to go in and revitalize the community, making it possible for those people to survive. So one of the things that happened here is these housing acts created a government backed incentive to go into these communities and clear them, not clear them, but revitalize them. And the way they chose to do it, for the most part, was to put in high rises because it concentrated the population, allowing them to remove the slums that were around these areas and improve them maybe with parkland or whatever. Problem is, they weren't around some kind of industry. And as a result, some bad things happened. So I'll give you some iconic examples here. There were three specific areas, one in Chicago called Robert Taylor Homes. Robert Taylor Homes basically was a high-rise set that was built in the Chicago area. And as soon as they made them, they immediately started having a problem. So first thing is they wiped out all the housing. Now, as I understand it, and I could be wrong, so I don't want to call out this specific community for this specific issue, but one of the things that happened is that there were something like 150,000 homes. They wiped them out. And then they built these high rises, and they only made 40,000 new homes in the high rises. What did that cause? Like a diaspora from those poor communities to other poor communities around the area or within some distance of that area. So it actually made the poverty worse. And then, because the high rises were built and they didn't build a whole town around them, there was no services. There were no businesses for people to work, or not enough businesses for people to work. One of the other things is because it was a high rise, before the sprawl actually allowed people to have eyes on the streets. And they knew when people were coming into the neighborhood that weren't part of the neighborhood. And they could call the police or they could deal with it. And that was a viable way to manage. But once you put everybody in a high rise, only the people on the first or second floor, maybe the first 5 floors, could actually observe the neighborhood and tell when something was happening. And there was an incident where they talked about a woman screaming for like 15 to 20 minutes or something like that while she was either being raped or beaten in public. And I think she died. I'm not sure. I don't remember the story clearly enough. And it's a well-documented story, so you could look back on this. And it happened in the 70s. Nobody came to help. Nobody. And as a result, that caused other violent acts to occur, because once you stop punishing and you make it easy for somebody to commit a crime, it's going to happen all over the place. People who get away with it will get away with it again and again. And then the population of the number of people who will commit violent crimes goes up. So the community did not have a way to protect itself because there was no observation. There was no cross viewing of what's going on. And because you weren't at ground level, you didn't think it affected you, right? So as a result, it was easy to ignore, or it seemed easy to ignore. But the second part of what made these things fail almost immediately was the government provided a great deal of money to build them and put nothing in the budget to maintain them. And a high-rise building is like a powerful machine that needs to be maintained. Between air conditioning, plumbing, electrical, fire systems, access control, camera systems, the hallways, everything has to be maintained. And you can't, and all of the common areas have to be looked after by somebody. So there is no budget for a building superintendent necessarily. There was no budget for a replacement elevator, replacement air conditioning unit, replacement plumbing. There was none of that. And as a result, these buildings basically started to crumble, right? And it became kind of a mark of shame, really, on our country that we could be so smart to come up with these great ideas and so stupid as to not plan for the outcomes. And we're not alone. We're not, America is a world of, creativity, and we do actually come up with some very good ideas. And some of them are still going quite well. But to just demonstrate for you, this was not exclusively us. China had this problem too. They had a real estate boom, and more recently, even with the examples of last century's slums that were converted and situations that occurred where they fell and crumbled, even though we had that as a prominent example, China made this mistake too. Now, that it didn't happen exactly the same, but they had an unmanaged, unscrutinized real estate bubble that occurred because they speculated. They built all of these high rises as though they were going to solve all of these problems. And in doing so, they started out with trying to build like crazy. And the reason that this worked in their case is because the government was looking at GDP, gross domestic product. And it was like, oh, let's just build. And the building caused gross domestic product to skyrocket, which made the country look wealthy or feel wealthy, if not look wealthy. And as a result, they just built like crazy and they overbuilt. They overbuilt to the point where they ended up with ghost cities, empty high rises, completely built out, ready to go. And just like our government's mistake, they did not fund the maintenance as part of the project. So as a result, these buildings ended up having to be destroyed. So they, the big growth was the GDP pushed. It was, their GDP was 25 to 30% of China's GDP just because they built like crazy, which made the whole country feel wealthy and prestigious. But unfortunately, they didn't budget. And because of the fact that they didn't do those budgeting and they didn't have oversight on the developers just went crazy. And now they have this oversupply that now has to be managed and eventually ripped down because there was no budget to maintain them long term. Same exact story, right? It almost became the same story. And there was another interesting side element that came into play here because it was speculative real estate. Speculative real estate meant that a bunch of people bought with the intention of making it a store of wealth, like buying gold. And so they bought into these properties, and the properties were going to be their nest egg that they could sell down the line when it came time for retirement, and they would have money and they'd be rich, right? Didn't happen that way because the oversupply in the ghost cities caused all of that to collapse. So eventually what ended up having to happen is the government had to get involved. So in 24 to 25, they started looking at these areas and they started putting in strict regulatory crackdowns to stop the growth from occurring because it was not sustainable. They created this thing called the 3 red lines, and the 3 red lines help to maintain liquidity or kind of recoup some of the liquidity that was lost when they dumped the money into the real estate, and then it was just like gone. So and they eventually stabilized the debt. The debt was outrageous because they made loans on building these houses. The builders took all the money and just disappeared or were no longer part of the project once they finished their project. And so now you've got a bunch of people with empty houses they can't rent or sell, and they owed out, crazy amount of money for what they had. So fortunately for them, the government, because the government benefited, they had a high GDP, they were able to buy back some of those properties and ease the burden on some of the people in the country. But the bust was severe, and they had to get pretty hardcore about, fixing this. This has been just as tough a situation for China as a lot of our slum situations have been for us. There's a racial element to what you see when you see it here in the United States, because a lot of the communities that were most deeply impacted by this poverty in the United States were Black communities and Hispanic communities in some cases too. And now white communities later, but earlier the Black community suffered the most. Well, the biggest issue was they had government programs to support you with a universal basic income called welfare to live in these communities that didn't offer you the ability to rise in economic status with jobs, education, and the services that would have made a better place for the people living there. And as a result, all they could see is, it's either a violent crime-ridden zone, or the hope and the prosperity that they were hoping for just went away. And this has happened in China as well, where now you've got the youth basically saying, what, I'm going to work so that you can retire? And they don't want to be involved. They don't want to be slaves the way previous generations essentially were. And let's face it, that is kind of what happened. Is here in the United States, we had slaves as, in the 1700s, 1800s, that time frame. And we, as a country, chose to abolish it, which was a great thing. And we, thankfully, we don't push that anymore in this country. Obviously, some would argue that corporations remain slave labor in some respects. Now, maybe the government is a slave labor organization. So you could take it any way you want. I'm not going to try and say any of those things are one thing or another. But when you look at all of our manufacturing being shipped out to countries like China for pennies on the dollar for what we charge to do something here, and now they're doing it in China, all we did is we outsourced our what was essentially, in some cases, slave labor. But slave labor in the United States was ultimately replaced with industrial labor, which was more, you could say in some respects, well, no, it was absolutely more humane, right? You didn't have people in bondage. Now you had people in bondage in a different way because they were tied with golden handcuffs to the industries. And then eventually we took those industries and made it cheaper again by shipping them overseas. So now we have people here that are used to being paid a very high income. All of the communities that we have are really designed for high income, and there's no jobs for the people that don't have those super high income skills. And then we have the added pressure now of AI pushing down from the top and taking all the high paying jobs, where all of the people who here have done pretty well, they're going to be out of work, right? All of the white collar jobs are going to go out the window, according to all of the AI proponents. And I think there's some truth to that. And there's also the potential that that won't happen, a very strong potential that that won't happen. But all of these programs that we've seen where people say, no, let's try a universal basic income. If you don't have the controls at the community level to prevent that from being abused, they will be abused. And if you build the communities wrong and you base the communities' funding on the wrong thing, like government contracts, and the government contracts dry up because a different party gets in office, it's going to fail. And if you put it on a company and the company fails, it's going to fail. And not long ago, Andrew Yang was speculating that if it's going to work, it's going to happen because people like the Dells actually directly fund it in a philanthropic manner. Well, when the Dells no longer have a philanthropic organization, I mean, look at the Gates Foundation. The Gates Foundation, I think, is dissolving. Maybe I'm wrong. I could be wrong. But I've heard that some of the Gates Foundation may be disappearing or going away. If that's the case, Bill Gates wanted to give away all of his riches. Wonderful. He's doing a wonderful thing for the world. But is that going to be sustainable forever? Maybe not, right? The thing that has been sustainable for long periods of time are the in corporations. When we go back to the initial conversations, things like the Amish villages, the 55 and over planned communities, the community land trusts that keep the land price down, the social housing and tools like Georgeism that help you to take a segment of an organization, of communities, and keep it the same, so that governments can't change it. A business going out of business isn't going to change it. And also, you don't have to worry about the philanthropical organization drying up and going out of business. So these type of communities can be sustainable long-term as long as enough protections are built around the communities to make sure that they are not wiped out by some future government or some business moving in and destroying everything. And that's where what I proposed in my previous video comes into play, where perhaps what they do is they go to these communities where they're going to put in a data center and a grid, supply for the grid, and they build the community around that so that the businesses are going to pop up to support the grid services and the AI services. And that becomes the philanthropical engagement where basically the people who are trying to build these data centers actually have to help create these types of land allowances, land grants, essentially, buy up the land and then put it into a mixed use situation. And that's a very important thing having to do with zoning that's critical for all of these, because in the zoning scenario, if you don't provide mixed use, you end up with circumstances where that's not possible, where it just isn't going to work. So let me just bring it up here. So here's the zoning breaches was part of what caused the some of those projects to fail. So the zoning regulations got changed, and because they were changed, it caused the crumbling of those situations. And going into this is actually the zoning breaches were actually the Chinese example of what happened. So they made zoning breaches, they made actually artificial islands as an example. And when they created these artificial islands, they were created illegally. They weren't created with the zoning in mind, and it breached the zoning requirements. So as a result, they had to tear them down. And they also, in the case of the high rises in China, they built higher than they were allowed to build, also causing zoning breaches, probably safety breaches as well. So when you look at the lessons that we have, and there are a lot of lessons here related to how these things could work and how things might not work. And there's another, some related urban models here that are happening now. So Barcelona has these super blocks that they've created. And the super blocks are 9 by 9 grid blocks in a city where what they're doing is they're trying to make it non-traffic oriented in the center of those blocks. So they leave the perimeter available for car access, but they reduce the speeds inside the grid, and they convert the grounds to a combined use where if cars come through, they have to go through at a very slow speed. And then you also have foot traffic universally. And they did that by, you had sidewalks and pavement. They just filled the pavement up to the level of the sidewalks everywhere, so that now everything is much more walkable, bikeable, and accessible for people with wheelchairs and things like that. And they created these city blocks inside of the cities where they became reclaimed land. Now, a good chunk of the motivation behind this was climate change. They wanted to reduce the carbon footprint of these cities. Now, whether or not you're a proponent of the green stuff is not really important here, because it's not about, you don't have to take it as having a planned community doesn't mean we need to greenify everything. But once these parks were created, these super blocks, and let's go back to the history again, because again, this goes way, way back. This is not about climate change. This is not about the Paris Accords. This is not about the lockdowns and things like that. None of that. The 15-minute cities, none of that came into play when these cities were originally designed. This goes back to way back to 1932. And in 1932, they were trying to build a contemporary framework for an urban city that was walkable and viable for a high density population. Now, some would argue that it was too brutal. If you look at the city blocks here, I mean, with all of this being pavement and these cities just being plopped down, is there potential for this to work out? Yes. I guess it depends on how many levels you built, because if you built too many levels here, the population's going to exceed where the ground areas are going to be viable. It becomes a nightmare. Now, a few stories, maybe that's fine. And now you could convert these cities into these very walkable communities that make patio style dining and street level businesses very viable. And because you don't have the high rise, maybe you don't get the effect like we had with the project slums, where the super big high rises made people indifferent to the things going on at the ground level. So there's there's definitely some positives that come out of some of these plans. And what has happened is the original plan fell apart over time because political motivation changed and things like that. But then it came back in part because they used the climate change model as an excuse to try and go reclaim these streets and portions of these streets and make them into something better for the people that live there. And that's wonderful. It did come out quite nice, in fact. But what ended up happening? Gentrification. Once these places became very nice to live in, it's and a good example, another American good example is places like Brooklyn and certain parts of the Bronx also had planning like this, and they had parks like this, and it was nice to go live there. And the problem is the gentrification comes in because once people find that it's such a wonderful place to live, they're going to all want to live there. And that causes the rents to spike, and it causes the property values to spike. And once that happens, poor people are pushed out again. If you're not at the top of the bucket, you're out. And once you run into that, then you're going to start having political shifts, because if you push out all the poor people, then one party or another is going to come along and say, but what about the poor people? And it becomes a rich neighborhood. And once it becomes a rich neighborhood, who do you think has the money to fund all of the politics? And suddenly they get to protect their own little zone. And now you again run into this gentrification issue. So there has to become a method of thinking about these types of scenarios where you protect it, and you protect the zone from gentrification by creating laws that prevent you from just allowing rents and property prices to go up too high. And that allows people who are not necessarily at the top of the economic scale to live in these communities. But it still allows a diversification of population to live there. You want people who make a lot of money to live in these communities because they're the ones who are going to start and own businesses. And those are the ones who are going to employ all of the people in the middle class and the lower class that are actually going to be able to survive in these communities. So what has to happen is that not only do we have to create rules to protect the zone, but we have to make sure that the zone itself has a diversification of income. And I'm not talking about diversity in terms of race. That isn't really an important facet. We don't want to have exclusive neighborhoods from a racial perspective any more than anything else. But when you protect the zone by having diversification of income, that ensures that you have people who have a lot of money, who are relatively self-actualized, like many of the people that we know about on the Moonshots and the All In podcast and the billionaires that are out there. They're at the top of the bucket. Wherever they live, their neighborhoods are probably pretty good, right? So, but if they are in the mix of these communities, they will actually do what they can to make the communities livable and nice. And if we make sure that we keep access to the low income for those communities, you end up with what eventually becomes maybe a funnel. Not everybody's going to want to work and become a billionaire at the same level, the way that billionaires are, kind of obsessive compulsive people that eventually are so strong-willed that they create something out of nothing and businesses just suddenly form. Not everybody's built to do that. But there is the potential for people that are around, when you're in a community where that type of diversification exists, you're exposed to the people who have this capability. And by being exposed to them, you inspire some of the people that maybe the children of the people who can't work above a certain level, and they do actually rise up and become something. So the services, I mean, the only way that universal basic income or universal high income works is that you have to have these structured communities to a degree, I believe, where you kind of prevent the running out the poor people, running out the middle people, and preventing the top tier from owning everything. But you let the top tier be part of it. I'm not trying to say that you don't, right? I'm not trying to. You should have the house on the hill here and there, where the folks who've worked their butt off ended up in that house on the hill, and it's an inspiration when you live in that neighborhood and you see the Mr. Jones or Mrs. Jones home at the top of the hill, and they're millionaires because they worked their butt off, and that inspires the people in the neighborhood to go, well, I could do that, right? And that's really why I think it really we have to find a way to keep these neighborhoods from completely stratifying into just layers, and everybody's at a different layer, and you keep the people at the low layer low, not because you want them there, but simply because without the right incentives, they have no purpose to go higher, right? If you can live without having to work and you don't have to worry about anything, you've got a universal basic income, some people are just going to stay where they are and they're going to be happy. And that's, in fact, it's not the worst thing in the world as long as you make it possible for those folks to survive in a way that doesn't turn into a poverty zone and a crime zone, right? So, and I don't know, I'm not trying to say that I have a solution here, because I don't. I'm just thinking out loud about how these things, what we've seen that works and what we've seen that doesn't work. And there have been a lot of plans. A lot of them have failed. None of them are perfect. But some of them are, brilliant failures. And most of the reason that they're failures has to do with building for a specific purpose. So a lot of cities were built with cars in mind. They were built so that you could commute. And that was because we were trying to promote cars as a cultural icon. It was a big thing. In the future, I believe when Robo-Taxi begins to take over, that will no longer be a cultural thing. It will be for a while, especially in rural areas where you're not going to have the same population density. You're going to have people having or car ownership, because that's just the nature of it. You won't be able to not own something. But the closer you get into the cities, the more you're going to rely on things like a Robo-Taxi. And once you get to the point where you see Robo-Taxi coming in at 25, 50 cents a mile, or even $1 a mile, it becomes super affordable and much less, logical to own a car when you live in a community where you can walk to almost everything and you don't have to own a car, technically, and that you've got a situation where car ownership is $3 to $4 a mile if you buy a car, between fuel costs or energy costs, repair costs, income, property tax on the vehicle, insurance on the vehicle, registrations and maintenance on the vehicle. All of these things, they build up and they cost a lot of money, making it very difficult to justify owning a vehicle when you can actually just use a semi-public transport in things like the Robo-Taxi and pay 50 cents a mile or $1 a mile. Much, much more affordable. And it becomes much more logical too, because we don't drive every day all the time. We drive, in many cases, it's twice a day to commute, right? On the way to work and on the way home. And some of these communities may make it possible for us to have work in the community where you can go to an office that exists in an office complex that's part of the community. And in doing so, you reduce the need for the vehicle. Again, people will walk for health, among other things, just to, get to work. And the community planning could really solve a lot of these problems. And when you're no longer a car culture, you're not pushing cars as the culture, you can find yourself in a situation where these communities would work. Now, one of the keys to why the Amish communities have worked for 300 years is because the horse and buggy doesn't require a license, doesn't require insurance, doesn't require a registration and all of that is like a heavy burden, and that people share and provide rides to each other using the horse and buggy, or they walk, or they bike. And that makes it very viable for those villages to maintain a very livable existence without having a massive car infrastructure. So we have examples of how this really works. And the bicycle industries for the Dutch, the bicycle cities for the Dutch, have also been a pretty good example of how that could work. Again, not everything is a perfect scenario. There's a buy-in to become Amish, right? You have to be part of the religious group that gets you into their community. So it's not just instant. It's not just easy. But if we have ways to build these things, and I'm only hoping that what I talk about inspires some people to look at this, that do urban planning, and think, how can we make these things effective and long term? And I was looking into whether or not those communities were affected by the blackouts. They were, but they weren't really impacted because they didn't lose access to transportation because they were very walkable communities. And this is, by the way, the Barcelona, Spain super blocks that I was looking at here. So, but the cool thing that happened with the super blocks that was very cool. The original plan was very much out of a green approach, and they built a number of these super blocks, and they successfully did what they did. And then a different political party came in, and in order to continue things, they actually continued the super block idea. They picked a different neighborhood. It was actually a lower population neighborhood, and they just kind of slapped it in. And that really kind of upset people. They actually used tires to kind of like break up the regions and prevent people from driving cars through them. Wasn't the most attractive starting point. But in the end, once people started to recognize these open community areas, the populations of that new area, even under a totally different political organization, were still able to continue the project forward. Now, whether or not all of they were talking about 500 super blocks they want to create in Barcelona, Spain. I sure hope they continue the project and continue the experiment. I think they only have 3 or 4 super blocks created. But remember this whole project, the history came from something that was already a plan back in 1930s. So they had a big plan to begin with, and they took the opportunity to take that plan and try and build it into something better. Paris is another example of a community that was kind of built this way, and they're also continuing to try and make the areas walkable. So there are a lot of areas where hopefully we can see these plans that we have a history to look back on, and maybe by looking back on the successes, the partial successes, and the failures, that maybe we can do a first principles approach to come back to how do we build this in a way that's sustainable going forward. Whether your motivations are about greening up the world because of climate change, or because you would like to see humanity actually have a place to live that's suitable for people to live long term and have a neighborhood. When the highway projects were kicked in back in the 50s for New York, one of the reasons New York became what it became is because they used eminent domain to rip down whole chunks of the city to put highways in, making it possible for people to move around the city fast and get in and out of the city. And what that ended up doing is creating a sprawl from the city, but it wiped out communities that were actually pretty tight-knit communities in the city. They literally had cultures that were just like 2 blocks away from each other, that because a highway went through it, they no longer had access to each other because you can't walk across the highway. So they lost the cultural elements of those cities, or of those communities in the city, which really destroyed kind of the dream of going to that area to begin with. So protecting these communities, building these communities first, finding plans that might work to recreate them, revitalize them, and then continuing them long term is really where I think the only way this is going to happen. And it's going to take, I don't want to say money, because we all know everybody throws money in a bucket, and the grifters take out a huge chunk of it, and then whatever's left is what gets used for the project. That can't keep happening. But we have to find a way for these communities to get built. And it may mean that we have to do a first principles engineering approach where, like what they tried to do with the projects, we rip some chunks of it down and start fresh. But we've got to make sure that what we displace is replaced. If you displace something, you can't be allowed to just push people out and say, sorry, too bad. It's got to be something that's built in a way that maintains the population density without dispersing the poorest amongst the people in those communities, and without making it easily gentrified, so that the people that move in those cities end up being all of the rich people with no, the one that really blows my mind is the number of multi-million-dollar apartments that exist in high-rises right down in Manhattan that are just empty. And they were purchased in part as speculative and also as stores of money, right? Stores of wealth. And they'll never be occupied. And that can't, it's going to happen. To a degree, it's always going to happen. But is there a way for us to design these cities, design a star city like around Starbase that has the precepts of some of these more functional long-term project plans that don't just dry up, and do that in multiple locations? And maybe if we can do enough of them, they reproduce. They become an infectious approach. And if we can keep the politicians from, poo-pooing things so hard that nothing ever happens, and our regulations are so strangling that you can't ever start a new project, if we don't loosen those restrictions, which I think the current administration is trying to do, you'll never have the opportunity to build things like this. So my hope is that we find a narrow path to weave through where we can build the communities that will be long-term, that will allow people to survive the decimation that AI may be bringing to us, the white-collar destruction of white-collar jobs that will make all of the people who are middle class now suddenly lower class because they don't have an income and they can only survive on what's given to them by the UBI, the people who hand out the UBIs. I would much rather see the people who are thinking about handing out UBIs go build these communities and allow people to find a place in them when they get kicked out of the jobs that they have, and they don't become poverty-stricken and ultimately maybe homeless. So anyways, I hope this was thought-provoking and useful, and something that, makes it at least in front of the eyes of some of the folks out there who are trying to see what they can do in the future. And whether it's a government program, a company-based program, or a philanthropic program, if we don't make sure that the communities themselves are built with integrity, the strength and integrity to last hundreds of years, we really do run the risk of creating brand new slums, brand new projects, and end up in a situation where people are displaced that were affluent and suddenly not. And I really believe these communities could be a wonderful place for people to live in the future, and could help the entire population from poor to rich survive in a way that they can hold their head up, be part of a community, feel good about where life will bring them, and maybe look forward to the future the way all of the AI proponents want us to look and be happy about what they're doing with our future. Anyways, I hope this was something that you enjoyed. And if you would like more, give me a thumbs up, a like, comments, please, if you want. And let me know what else you'd love to hear about in relation to these kinds of projects and discussions. I'll bring some more of these discussions forward in time. But until then, I bid you adieu, and I hope that you have a great day and look forward to talking to you again soon.